Hey everybody, my name is Jamie. Oh my goodness, I can't play guitar. Welcome back to the Daily Hangout, part 2. Earlier today we played some guitar. Right now we're just watching some videos. We'll be playing guitar. Thanks for hanging out with us. We're going to be watching through First Thought, going over the end of their news segment, and then we've got some other goodies in store. We'll team up as they come up. Thanks for watching. You can check out the videos in the description after the live stream. But if you want to know what they are, just ask in the comments and we'll let you know. We'll send you a link. Thanks for joining us. Let's hang out.
Died and more than 100 were rescued after a fishing boat carrying immigrants and refugees capsized and sank off the southern coast. Tragedies like these will only become more common as the crises of capitalism and imperialism accelerate, causing mass suffering as a consequence of imperialist wars, environmental disaster, and systemic oppression. And in positive news of the day, 4 young children have been found alive after more than a month wandering the Amazon, the rainforest, not the corporation. According to Colombian President Gustavo Petro, they survived like children of the jungle. He went on to say, "They're learning from indigenous families, and their learning of living in the jungle has saved them." The president broke the news on Friday, after announcing on Twitter that the children had been found 40 days after they went missing following a plane crash.
Kids are goats.
That's all for today. We'll be back day after tomorrow with more news. If you'd like to see episodes with more in-depth analysis, consider supporting the show on Patreon so we can grow and expand.
Artist who destroyed their career in seconds. Alright, well, we gotta watch this. The only rapper who made Eminem apologize.
These artists' careers were never the same after one incident, whether it was from their own terrible decisions or a minor misstep that got blown out of proportion. Today we are going to discuss them all, starting with Macklemore, who leaked a text message that made everyone question what they thought they knew about him. In 2012 and 2013, you could not go anywhere without hearing the song Thrift Shop. Far from your typical rap song, Macklemore flexed $20 and had suburban moms dancing to his funky saxophone. This song spent 6 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Mac had one-hit wonder written all over him. He carried the most stereotypical white rapper image that is perceived as corny by hip-hop culture, but he proved everyone wrong with his second hit, Can't Hold Us, which spent 5 weeks at the #1 spot. This track was definitely more of a standard pop track, but 2 Billboard #1s in his first year as a mainstream artist stamped that he was a force to be reckoned with. However, it was all about to come crashing down, as Macklemore would suffer from success. At the 2014 annual Grammy Awards, Macklemore was nominated in 7 categories, the biggest and most prestigious being Best Rap Album and Best Rap Song. After winning Best Rap Performance and Best New Artist, people were happy to see him win 2 Grammys. Nominated for Best Rap Song up against Drake, Kanye West, Jay-Z, it seemed unlikely Macklemore would win, but Thrift Shop was in fact the winner of Best Rap Song of 2014, securing him his 3rd Grammy of the night. But what would come next would shock the world. Up against Drake's Nothing Was the Same, Jay-Z's Magna Carta, Kendrick Lamar's Good Kid Mad City, and Kanye West's Yeezus, Macklemore had absolutely no chance of winning. Everyone was betting on Kendrick since he without a doubt had the best album of the bunch, but wouldn't be entirely surprised if it went to the other nominees. The hip-hop community was floored when Macklemore and Ryan Lewis's The Heist won Best Rap Album of the Year. The Heist couldn't be a more fitting name for this absolute robbery. Macklemore was being cooked by the hip-hop community online, reminding him in every comment section that he didn't deserve to win. He felt so much pressure that he decided to text Kendrick Lamar and apologize. "You got robbed. I wanted you to win. You should have. It's weird and sucks that I robbed you. I was gonna say that during the speech, then the music started playing during my speech and I froze. Anyway, you know what it is. Congrats on this year and your music. Appreciate you as an artist and as a friend. Much love." We wouldn't have ever seen this text if Macklemore didn't post it to social media, which made it even worse and looked like he was just trying to get in the good graces with the public.
Did you ever feel any way about him posting the text message or anything like that?
Yeah, I think it was uncalled for, to be 100 with you. When he sent it to me, I was like, okay, you know, I could see him feeling that type of way because he a good dude. But I think for confirmation from the world, you know, he probably felt like he had to put it out there, which he didn't need to do. He didn't need to do, but I don't take nothing away from him anyway because I know where his heart is at. He cool.
Despite Kendrick being cordial and saying that Macklemore meant well, hip-hop fans could never truly accept Macklemore as a part of the culture. They thought he was disingenuous, and they didn't really like his music in the first place, so this was an easy excuse to forget about him. He stepped out of the limelight, and many people suggest his music was never as ambitious ever again. He felt guilt, and that guilt ate him alive. His 2016 album, This Unruly Mess I Made, sold just 61,000 copies in the first week. Him and Ryan Lewis split up shortly after, and Mac released another solo album, Gemini, that did decent amongst his fan base, but ultimately, he hasn't had any major mainstream success in almost a decade. But unlike Macklemore, DaBaby refused to apologize to anyone, which is leading to one of the dumbest downfalls of all time. Baby exploded onto the mainstream rap scene in 2019 with his hit song Suge, which peaked at number 7 on the Billboard Hot 100. In a world of repetitive melodic trap, DaBaby felt fresh and exciting, providing us with bouncy and fun bangers. He dominated for the next 2 years, constantly having multiple singles on the Billboard Hot 100, and he was in regular rotation on the radio. His track Rockstar with Roddy Ricch was the number 1 song for 7 weeks straight, a very tough thing to do as a hip-hop artist. But DaBaby was always known for having a bold personality. He was the type to say whatever he wanted, and if you had a problem, he was more than willing to handle it. He even killed a guy in Walmart. Don't worry, it was self-defense. Well, in July of 2021, on the stage at Rolling Loud, his loose lips got him in major trouble. Maybe some that he can't recover from.
You didn't show up today with HIV, AIDS, any of them deadly sexually transmitted diseases that'll make you die in 2-3 weeks. Put a cell phone light in the air. Lady, if your pussy smell like water, put a cell phone light in the air. Fellas, lights up. Fellas, if you ain't sucking nigga in the parking lot, put your cell phone lights in the air.
Completely unprovoked and for no reason at all, DaBaby was thinking about gay men and what they do in their free time while he was on stage performing. He referred to people with AIDS as dirty and will likely die soon from the illness. Both statements are categorically and factually untrue. The clip was shared onto the internet and sent millions of people into an uproar. DaBaby addressed this on his Instagram and clarified his message.
I wasn't going on no rant. That's called a call to action. That's what that's called, because I'm a live performer. I'm the best live performer. I'm the live show killer.
Yo, what are you talking about,
interact with your fans. You get what I'm saying? Look, all the lights went up gay straight. You want to know why? Because even my gay fans don't got fucking AIDS, stupid ass niggas.
Him doubling down on his comments made everything way worse, as he clearly was very uneducated on the AIDS disease.
He said even my gay fans don't fucking have it.
And the unfair stigmas that come with it. And although he eventually issued an apology addressing the LGBTQ community, he had made countless contradictory statements after. He tried to profit off the controversy in music videos and even kind of redacted his own apology.
If I say what I say to get people to raise their cell phones and it's misinterpreted by people who watch a 5-second clip at home, you're not supposed to understand what's going on. You couldn't raise your cell phone if you wanted to, so you ain't supposed to be able to digest a clip, you know what I'm saying? A clip that has been altered and shortened with a narrative to go along with it, with enough people driving it, it's gonna do what it do.
From here, he got kicked off every major festival in 2021 that he was supposed to perform at. And even when he did perform, he was booed and had garbage thrown at him. A-list celebrities and fellow collaborators condemned him, but the controversy continued. He got into fights, tormented and broke down the mother of his child on Instagram, tried to kiss one of his fans without consent. DaBaby was not trying to save face. He just kept saying, "I'm sorry for being me." His ticket sales plummeted, which resorted to him offering buy one get one free deals to fill out the venues. One report alleged that he only sold 500 tickets to a venue that holds 14,000 people, and he claims to have lost $30 million because of the controversy.
Like what were the L's?
A week or two after, $30 million that I would have had before the drop. 2021. So this happened rolling out with July. I had $30 million worth of shows on the schedule before December 31st.
Yeah,
all he had to say was, put your hands in the air if you just don't care, and all of this could have been avoided. But if you think what DaBaby said was bad, you'll be horrified by what CeeLo Green said in a series of questionable tweets. If you don't remember the name CeeLo Green or his previous duo Gnarls Barkley, you definitely remember his 2 most iconic songs, Crazy and For You. Crazy peaked at number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 and spent 29 weeks on the chart. Forget You would...
Alright, I'm just gonna say it. Fuck You is a dope song. Now let's see how big of a piece of shit Gnarls Barkley is. Or not Gnarls Barkley, CeeLo Green.
She released Solo 4 years later, also went number 2 on the Hot 100 after spending almost a full year on the charts. CeeLo had a very unique voice and was undeniably talented. He pretty much only gave us 2 hits, but was an ever-present pop culture figure throughout the early 2010s. Whether he was hosting an award show, his own reality show, voice acting, or being a judge on The Voice, CeeLo was loved and appreciated. Until some shocking allegations arose. CeeLo was accused by a 33-year-old woman he dined with at a downtown Los Angeles sushi restaurant of placing ecstasy, also known as MDMA or Molly, in her
Hanging
drink.
out with Ari
The woman
Shaffir.
later told Los Angeles police detectives she woke up naked in bed in her hotel room with Green. CeeLo allegedly admitted to law enforcement that he took ecstasy, but denied drugging the woman's drink or committing sexual assault. CeeLo's sexual assault charges were dropped after prosecutors concluded there wasn't enough evidence to take that accusation to court, but he was found guilty on drug charges, which landed him 3 years probation. But it wasn't the nature of the charges that ruined his career, it's what he said on Twitter after the case. After being criticized by people in public tweets, he decided to respond. Women who have really been R-worded, remember, but point taken. So if I tried but did not succeed, but the person said I did, then what really happened? When someone breaks in a home, there is broken glass. Where is your plausible proof anyone was R-worded? If someone passed out, they're not even with you consciously, so with implies consent. It's hard to see what point he was trying to make here, but the blogs were not holding back. CeeLo, it's not rape if you forget. CeeLo Green, it isn't rape if the victim is unconscious. After these tweets, his reputation was destroyed. He lost all of his live performance bookings, he quit The Voice to avoid being fired, his TV show was canceled, and he basically disappeared from the pop culture zeitgeist, pretty much surviving off royalties and small film roles here and there. But I guess him and I are friends now?
Yo, Pat, what's up, man? I'm assuming that your friends call you Pat.
My friends do call me Pat, so...
And, I consider myself to be one of your friends.
The next person on our list lost her career from something that was totally out of her control. In fact, it may have even been a setup. Janet Jackson is a woman who needs no introduction. She is the youngest of the 9 iconic Jackson family siblings. Although she was not a part of the original Jackson 5, she would go on to have a massive solo music career. Jackson signed the first of 2 record-breaking multi-million-dollar contracts with Virgin Records, establishing her as one of the highest-paid artists in the industry. She was named by Billboard magazine in the 90s as the second most successful recording artist of the decade in the United States after Mariah Carey. Over 100 million records sold, 10 Billboard #1 songs, 27 top 10 hits. She is easily the most successful artist on this list, which is why her downfall is even more tragic. The Super Bowl in America is always the most watched televised program every year, with an average of around 100 million people watching the game. The halftime show has historically been a major milestone in an artist's career, as it is the biggest stage they will likely ever be on. In 2004, Janet Jackson was asked to do the show, but not by herself, which was surprising since she easily had enough hits to do a full set. Instead, she only got to perform 2 of her songs. The other time was filled out by Justin Timberlake, Diddy, Nelly, Kid Rock, and Jessica Simpson.
Yeah.
The very last song of the performance was Justin's hit song, Rock Your Body, in which Janet assisted him. The 2 met at the center of the stage to pose for the grand finale. Justin reaches across Janet's body and pulls off the chest piece of her costume, exposing her breast to 90 million people. The wardrobe malfunction is considered the biggest controversy in televised history. This incident was actually the inspiration for YouTube because of the difficulty finding footage to rewatch online. Now, to some degree, this was planned. Justin's intention was to pull the leather piece off her chest and expose the red underneath, but he ripped too much. In the split second the camera was on Janet, you can see her look down in shock. She tried to cover herself while Timberlake stood holding the ripped pieces of her costume and bra. The FCC received more than 500,000 complaints after the performance. CBS was fined $550,000, and the halftime sponsor AOL demanded a return of the $10 million million advertising cost they paid to the NFL. Justin apologized, MTV apologized, Janet apologized, even though she later regretted it because it was an accident.
She didn't do anything.
The media went into an all-out frenzy. The FCC investigated the halftime show to see if this was a planned media stunt meant to shock the world, citing that because she was wearing a nipple covering, that was evidence this was all set up. Class action lawsuits were filed against Janet by random citizens, claiming that her sexually explicit performance deserved maximum punitive damages. Every talk show host in the nation dragged her. Viacom had to pay out $3.5 million to settle various indecency complaints, so they went and banned all radio and TV stations that they owned from playing any of Janet Jackson's music. Janet was blackballed from the music industry over an accident, and Justin was not punished at all, even though it was definitely his fault. There is no doubt her punishment was unfair and likely due to her gender and race. Her career after that wasn't totally dismantled. She did have a #1.
Regardless of what you think of politics, that was just... I don't even like Janet Jackson's music, but that was just kind of shitty. At the time, 2003, I was about 13, I think when that happened, 12 years old. So really was just like, oh, Janet's titty, really crazy. But in retrospect, shitty that she got in trouble for that. I don't know that Justin should have gotten in trouble for it more, but there's quite a few videos that go over actually the situation where just kind of sad what happened to Janet Jackson because of it. She's fine, I'm sure, like monetarily. I'm sure she could maintain her lifestyle mostly, or just live a little more modestly, but as a precedent for what happens to someone, and mental health wise for her, very shitty. And it only seemed to like galvanize Justin Timberlake as like a sex symbol icon doing that, honestly. Like, I personally remember, again, I was about 12 years old. My parents didn't really comment on it, besides like, they were very non-political, so it's like, oh, that was bad, I guess. So my take was like, oh, that's Justin Timberlake, who's like fucking could just do whatever he wants, basically. Yeah, wasn't great. Let's keep going.
Album, a Grammy nomination, some light Billboard presence, but this incident lingered like a dark cloud over her head for many years, and slowly she faded out of the mainstream.
I am one of those women who have been gagged, both literally and emotionally, women who have been abused, women who have been intimidated, women who have lived in fear. I stand with you. You are my sisters.
However, today, most people can all agree that this was just an overreaction, and she is still highly regarded as one of the most iconic pop stars of all time. Overreacting to small mistakes seemed to be common in the early 2000s, because this next artist's career was destroyed by something so small, it's almost unbelievable.
She was hot.
Ashlee Simpson was the younger sister of the already famous pop star Jessica Simpson, who was a multi-platinum Billboard charting recording artist. She also had her own MTV show. Newlyweds, Nick and Jessica was one of the most popular programs on the network. MTV wanted to capitalize on the Simpson sisters' newfound fame and gave Ashlee her own series called The Ashlee Simpson Show. The series ran for 2 seasons and aired every week on MTV directly after Jessica's show. Viewers who were invested in Jess were introduced to Ashlee immediately after. Ashlee was desperate to not live in the shadows of her sister. She dyed her naturally blonde hair brown and built a pop-punk image to complement her pop-rock music. Her album's lead single, Pieces of Me, became an instant hit in the United States. The song peaked at number 5 on the US Billboard Hot 100 and sold over 500,000 copies nationwide. Ashlee's debut album was released soon after, with an estimated 398,000 copies sold in its first week. Worldwide, the album sold more than 5 million copies. She had a bigger debut than her sister, but her career ended just before it took off. Saturday Night Live, 2004. Ashlee Simpson was set to perform her single Pieces of Me when this happened.
On a Monday, I am waiting. Tuesday, I am fading.
You might might be kind of confused as to what happened. Basically, the backing vocals started playing before Ashley expected them, as it was her intention to lip sync her performance, but instead of trying to catch up to the song, she stood there in a panic, then hit this extremely awkward jig dance twice, before ultimately exiting the stage without saying anything. The show cut to commercial, and when it came back, she blamed her band.
Ladies and gentlemen, what can I say? Live TV.
Exactly. I feel so bad my band started playing the wrong song, and I didn't know what to do, so I thought I'd do a hoedown. I'm sorry.
If she just told the truth right away, she may have been able to avoid the backlash, but instead, Ashley became a laughingstock.
On a Monday, sorry. On Tuesday, you called me.
This is so parodied, holy shit.
Even news anchors poked fun at her.
Sister's performance on Saturday Night Live was, well, out of sync, you could say.
All right, sorry, we had to do that.
Yes,
It was just
yes.
our own little lip-syncing adventure.
We were mocking her.
At just 19, she was publicly ridiculed by the world. And this is all especially
used to think she
ridiculous
was hot,
considering
too.
today's standards are much lower. It almost feels like lip syncing isn't even a real thing anymore. Half of my favorite artists at their live shows just let the song play, jump around, and yell random ad-libs. Even though Ashley was a decent performer, and she did have an opportunity to redeem herself on various late-night shows, nobody wanted to give her a second chance. It was too much fun to make jokes and boo her off stage.
Yeah, you can use auto-tune live now. No one gives a fuck. Tom DeLonge sounds good live now.
She did have a moderate comeback with her single Boyfriend in 2005, and her second
remember
album
that.
eventually selling 3 million copies worldwide, but
that's
she had
pretty
already
good.
seen the peak of her music career, and as it slowly dwindled away, she maintained her relevance in the 2010s through relationships,
Damn,
various
that was like
television
a
projects,
very
and her
aggressive
own
kiss.
social media. But the last person on our list has the most unexpected, shocking, and horrifying incidents that landed them in prison. In 2015, the world was dancing to Silent-O's hit song, Watch Me. The song paired with the massive viral dance, the whip and the nay-nay. All of social media was flooded with videos of people doing the dance. With Vine and Instagram peaking in popularity, Silent-O laid the foundation for what would become extremely normal on TikTok many years later.
Justin
He
Bieber,
performed at
man.
award shows, on Nickelodeon,
from
every
near where
talk
my
show in
mom's from,
America.
in
The virality
Ontario.
got the single to number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100, as well as 1.8 billion views on YouTube. Today, the record is 6 times platinum. Unfortunately, hip-hop dance tracks have a history of being impossible to outdo, because for every one that becomes culturally iconic, there are hundreds of cheesy failed attempts to recreate the moment. Silent-O waited 3 years to drop his album fresh out of high school, which failed to generate any buzz, and his second album went almost totally unnoticed. But before you could fully count him out, he made a decision that officially ended his career. On January 21st, 2021, the 23-year-old rapper was arrested for the murder of his cousin, 34-year-old Frederick Brooks, after a shooting in DeKalb County, Georgia. Police said officers found Brooks suffering from multiple gunshot wounds at a home off of Deep Shoals Circle. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators did not have a suspect at the time. Responding officers were able to obtain video from the security cameras of multiple residents and later identified Hawk, or Silent-O, as the gunman. Silent-O was arrested February 1st, 2021, and then later indicted by a Georgia grand jury on 4 felonies: 1 count of malice murder, 1 count of felony murder, aggravated assault, and gun possession during the commission of a felony. As of now, the court has deemed Silent-O unfit for the safety of the public and will remain incarcerated until further trial. Since the trial has not started yet, we don't know how he did it, we don't know why he did it, and we don't know how long he might be in jail, but we do know is that his career is officially over.
Okay. What else? Blah, 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 blah. Well, this is a really long video. Aiden Ross will never change. Oh yeah, Disney's Pixar Problem by Oldone. check it out.
A couple months ago, I made a video addressing the concerns of Pixar and...
By the way, I already played guitar earlier, so I'm just fucking around on the bass because I'm just trying to relax a little bit. This is a Bronco bass, and we're just playing it through our guitar amp, so...
Elemental's release, and it's actually sad to say that things actually look much worse from here on out. Because at this point, it has been recently announced that Pixar has made some layoffs, which include the director of Lightyear and the producer who actually saved Toy Story 2, letting go the biggest layoffs they've ever had since the release of The Good Dinosaur, which is not good at all. And this is also coming off the year of massive layoffs across Disney after they decided to bring Iger back and the consistent failure they have been experiencing throughout the past few years, where the release of Elemental is inching closer and closer and also isn't looking quite as good as Pixar should expect. Because recently the movie actually premiered at the Cannes Film Festival and it wasn't well received. Granted, it is still way too early to judge for us as public audiences even now, where I feel like I'm warming up to some of the charm that the movie has to offer, but the film's box office tracking also does not look good either, piling on another problem that Pixar is experiencing these days. One that actually sort of starts with Lightyear being their grand return to theaters before that turned out to be a complete failure. But the reason I am making this video is to address this head-on of Disney's overall problem that they are doing to Pixar, one that is making them suffer in animation and storytelling that we didn't expect when once again other studios like Sony are making big movies in their animation to get to the next level. Because when we look at Pixar, we think of the studio that did change animation that we see today, in the cases of 3D that affected the course that DreamWorks was going to go, and eventually Disney themselves that they have produced wonderful, fantastic stories in the 3D realm. But also, because of that, it can be said that it is Pixar's fault that traditional animation has gone out of the picture for most of these studios. No one as of this recording has dared to actually return to that in Americans film studios, and the only thing that they're willing to do is to make live action remakes, where now we all know it's not just Disney doing it anymore, it's also Universal with their own DreamWorks movies. I mean, another thing to add is just at the very least there hasn't been any live action remakes of Pixar films because they put elements in their films that can't be remade in that form, but somehow cannot pull it together when making original stories this day and age under the tyrannical umbrella of Disney. Like, I don't think anyone remotely has a hatred or overall problem with Pixar as a studio, but rather they are bored of the mainstream ideas or just too niche with their stories when looking at the latest films like Luca or Turning Red. And all of this has to do with the problem with Disney themselves, releasing these movies on Disney Plus rather than returning to theaters. Now, this isn't totally their fault, considering during Luca's time COVID was still very rampant and safer to release and watch on streaming instead, but when they actually did that to Turning Red and instead put Lightyear to theaters, actually started to make things worse for Pixar and the expectations that the audiences are going into, because the style of those two films are clearly more different than what we usually associate with Pixar of the past. These films still have the charm but are more visually different and takes a more niche down idea rather than the broad ones we had before. This is compared to their own golden age, where you put things that aren't human and portray them in human ways like toys or monsters or even rats that cook, that they managed to take human element really well into an animated form, and that these ones took the simplicity of what we knew and translated within this unique idea that wasn't seen at the time by other studios. And you can put the cases similar into these films like Luca and Turning Red, but use humans a lot more in a relatable aspect of that part of the world, which is actually cool too. Luca in this case uses sea monsters and transforms them into humans to interact with that part of the world, specifically the director's childhood time in Genoa, Italy, and then using that as a metaphor for feeling different, while the next film in Turning Red usually takes a look at this Chinese-Canadian girl who turns into a red panda when she's going through the emotional puberty stage and generational differences, where both remain really unique and heartfelt but still very niche down to the broader picture that was associated with earlier films. That isn't to say that this is completely a bad thing, because these are actually pretty good films, but the reason those films were explosive successes is because they can translate to any person at all, making it more easily accessible if you know what I mean. I also bring up this part to discuss because of those Disney Plus release problems, because at this point it does look like Elemental is actually going to bomb at the box office, similar to how Lightyear was the previous year before, and that has to do with what Disney is doing with their recent films, both on and off the platform. Now, that's not to say Disney Plus by itself isn't big, because it is the third largest streaming service out there, but the budgets they have and the films they release aren't making the money they want, because most people these days now expect it to be here instead of out there on the screen that many families can actually enjoy to watch in a film theater. It is here we see Disney overall affecting the path of Pixar for the worst rather than the better, similar to Disney's own rocky period near the end of Eisner's tenure as CEO and the problems they actually had with Pixar that was relieved when Iger bought Pixar back in 2006 when he took over. But even after that and the other successes we saw, it only lasted for so long before the quality overall dropped. Because looking at before, we did have films like Brave, which was Pixar's attempt at princesses on their side, but actually that didn't actually work at all. The production behind it was so messy and makes you think what could have been for the story instead of the bear-centric whatever type of movie that we know of today. A movie that was going to be Pixar's first directed by a woman who actually did Prince of Egypt, but they actually didn't want to go that route and only waited until Turning Red to prove how wrong they were with that own idea. Like consistently during this entire time after the 2010s, Pixar was making terrible choices that actually affected the overall quality of the studio that we know of. And then during the same time was the release of Pixar sequels. The 2010s were mainly focusing on extending Pixar into franchises itself, and most actually didn't work because the first instance was starting off strong with the wonderful conclusion that Toy Story 3 did, and knowing that Toy Story worked because they actually put effort behind the story and didn't actually plan to have sequels at all. But then during the same era as Toy Story 3 began, it ended with an unnecessary one like what Toy Story 4 did. And this is all due to their worst film being sequel to Cars and Cars 2, showing that this idea isn't that very good. I mean, Cars by itself is the weakest franchise to come out of Pixar, but it isn't as bad as what most people say. But this problem is still due to what they did with Cars 2. The idea of it was totally wasted and flawed and never really got what the story was about in any way. It's a fun adventure as a side piece or short story, but never as a movie, and it really showed. Nothing here was communicated well, and that still continued on as time went on. And this spiraled out of control with mediocre stories like Good Dinosaur and The Incredibles 2. I say this in this sequel era because Finding Dory is still a good heartwarming adventure, but still overall felt unnecessary in the story that sidelined its original main characters for the comic relief as the main for the same exact story that we saw in Finding Nemo. Not great, but not terrible at all. Because they still did release classics in the same time frame like Coco, but was too focused on these constant, consistent release of sequels that came out a long time after their original films. Each of these films are not fully focused on the characters or its overall stories like I have explained in The Incredibles 2, because it's more focused towards its main message that feels a bit more shallow since they aren't taking them to places that they've already charted from in the very first film. It just doesn't feel very necessary overall in the plot. The more I think about it from my first video, the more apparent it has become that Disney as their parent company is harming them as a creative film studio. Yes, they might help to distribute the earlier films, but that was still on them, and nowadays it's directly under the umbrella of Disney, which contributes to the hard times they face now as a company in trying to tell creative stories, which they cannot. They have pushed them into this safer territory with the rest of their own company, which has sort of affected the output of stories like I have seen in Onward and so forth. And if the concerns of The Good Dinosaur remain, then it will still translate over into something like Elemental because it is directed by the same very person. Not that I think he's bad, but it's just overall feeling that they have been very lackluster in the public reception, and that we cannot expect it to be a great masterpiece when it does come out. Because even though they prove us wrong with the reception of Toy Story 4, we still have to mention time and time again that it isn't a good story for the franchise overall. That sometimes you have to live with that things cannot continue, but that is not the case when Inside Out is also getting a sequel and Toy Story is yet again in the 5th film. That despite box office success of each sequel, it still doesn't mean it's a good story overall. Thinking back on how the original Incredibles aged really well when you grow up, while its sequel really doesn't when you think about the very details involved in the film. Because that's another element they need to remember, the fact that still remains that older Pixar is superior because it still connects with the adults in its story and mature messages, and not just the nostalgia from your youth. Because sometimes the layers to a film that Pixar had was that it can capture something for adults as well as kids at the very same time. That the story can fit your life at any age no matter who you are or what you did, and you cannot say that for any of these sequels I mentioned, especially Cars 2 because it sucks. I mean, these films still are enjoyable
really
to the
hates
surface
Cars
for its charm and
Alright,
continuation.
I'm gonna let this play for a sec.
The original
I'm gonna
film
go
and
get
animation and
refreshment.
continuing that, but having
Y'all
a side-by-side
enjoy. Be right
comparison
back.
shows that
We're
they
gonna keep
lack
playing
the sort of
bass.
charm
This is
from
really fun.
before in every single way. We have just reached a certain point where Disney's overusage of 3D in this era in their own content and everyone else to a certain degree has limited the potential of Pixar from the powerhouse it once was. That their own refusal to use 2D again has caused them overall to become safe and uninnovative, where people stop caring about these very stories. Like if you go back to Onward, you sort of get this feeling like it could have been something that Disney produced on their own, a modern fairy tale in 3D that looks like something modern Walt Disney Animation would produce on their own, and you can really see that. It doesn't mean it was bad because I've made it clear it is a good story and and still has Pixar charm to it, but lacks overall for the actual feeling you have with Pixar and the original separation that we've made before between Disney and Pixar themselves. And Disney themselves, by doing this, has also made them suffer in their own studio. Their own sequels suffer from the main problems that this Pixar one has, but to a worse degree, because unlike them, they have never made a great sequel at all, and I really mean that. And then you go back to the present day concerns of films like Wish, and it adds on to another problem of how far they're willing to take their stories or animation anymore. I'm not saying overall it makes it bad, because it can still work with a good story, but you have to constantly bring up the success and changes that films like Spider-Verse has provided, where not only are they able to create different and unique animation for its film, they are able to provide the story that goes along it that enhances those details and choices to make that stands out, something that goes above and beyond, similar to the ideals that older Disney had when Walt was at the helm to go for the bigger and bolder choices, the same ones that the corporation even used when it saw the potential in Pixar to make these films. And films like Wish or even Elemental is not taking that far enough, and it just feels lackluster and taking a step back from the type of style that they're producing. It is stagnant and it's not actually changing things like Spider-Verse did. So it really doesn't make sense for them to do any of this and constantly make decisions that harm the public perception of the movies. And I really think if they had a theatrical release for stuff like Turning Red and Luca, it would put things a lot better for them instead of releasing Lightyear the same year as Turning Red, and which doesn't make any sense because that was the same year that DreamWorks was diving into this very style with Puss in Boots and The Bad Guy. So you see, people really feel invested in these types of styles in storytelling, but it's just that they refuse to do so as a company, being one that wants to do lackluster fairy tales these days and just banking off nostalgia of what already worked. Like the executives nowadays just see the Disney Renaissance and think that is the peak and highest that they could go in their own animation, so let's remake them instead of focusing our money on making these creative, interesting stories instead in Pixar and others that actually need it most. Instead of doing something for that like Pixar, let's just slap a familiar IP onto the newest project, hence things like Lightyear appearing instead. And I do feel sad for the fact that they had to let the director of this film go from Pixar, because this film doesn't feel like a decision of their own. It really feels like a Disney decision themselves to continue writing off of the Toy Story name instead of making a film to be whatever they really need it to be. Like I have said numerous times with its characters and villain, that it really doesn't make sense because you have something established from previous films that is far more different than what you have presented here and making people more confused on the topic and the world that it is part of. It didn't help to convince people that you were watching a movie within the universe that came from a movie, because that also didn't feel like that helped out to make the decisions they make otherwise in those universes. It just feels overall lacking any substance because of the fact and the realistic approach to animation that the movie was trying to go for, considering it is a film within a film and not actually widely different or taking things above the edge like Turning Red did earlier that same year. Releasing something like Lightyear was never a good idea for them to begin with in terms of storytelling, and it really does suck. And of course, if they had released Turning Red in that same time frame instead to switch it up, then that film actually would have succeeded a lot more than they would have thought. The only one to work out in this advantage within the Disney era besides Toy Story in sequel or prequel content was in fact Monsters University, because they still had a great message compared to the rest of their sequels and Lightyear, but still never fully satisfied because they decided to ride off the peak of their 2000s era of films instead of doing something new. And then this has to go back with the concerns of Elemental being the same familiar story, different animation wise, but you still sort of have this notion of the been there done that attitude with the familial Romeo and Juliet story that has been presented to us by the trailers. Granted, at this time it is before its release, where I have warmed up to the ideas that the film is presenting, knowing I cannot judge a film that hasn't been released yet, where the score actually sounds beautiful, done by Thomas Newman, who has created one of Pixar's best soundtracks, but it still ties in with the same familiar issues plaguing the studio to this day. It's something I realize has already been discussed before.
Looks cool.
And feel
All right,
like
be right
repeating what others have already said, especially here on YouTube with myself, but knowing these changes that Disney has been making themselves, it's really hard to ignore at this point considering what is happening around us with recent films that have been released. I still think overall at this point that Pixar does have the edge over Disney, but they really do feel like they're both blending together, and that is simply a bad thing. Not to say that there are still key differences between the studios to this day, but overall with the decisions of some of the stories, you really can't tell them apart, and that is sad. Still tying back into that idea of bringing back to the animation, because there's nothing wrong with doing that at all for Disney. Because once again, it is not a good sign when your next film is shaping up to be a box office bomb like Lightyear was, or people not knowing if Wish actually looks good. Since when that actually happens, it overall ties in what happens from the executive standpoint, because unlike Lightyear, a straight sequel with familiar characters characters that most people already know of always have the potential of generating tons of money for the studio. I mean, outside of Cars, most of them have actually been billion-dollar successes for their sequels. Not one of them are actually really financial failures if you think about it. And this will be the likely scenario that they will face afterwards when Inside Out actually comes out, because we know of how successful the movie brand was and how it translates to a great success when the sequel gets released. But that is still a huge problem considering what we've already talked about in this video and the creativity that Pixar has had before. It just feels like this causes more chaos than good, where from the first Toy Story to Up, they actually had this huge roll of fantastic original films where each of them actually did great financially and critically, really flowing well with each other even if it wasn't related in the slightest, unless you count the Pixar theory, which isn't true at all. And unfortunately, this is the same thing that is happening with Disney once again, with Frozen 3 as an announced film, even though the second one quite frankly sucked, reiterating the same notion that they are now virtually the same studio but now put in different locations, which is stupid but the truth considering what Iron Fist Disney has for their films these days. It just feels like they make these films now in order to resell it to us later as cheap but also expensive live action remakes 10 years later after it was released, and nothing added to the art of what was. That now, between these stories, whatever doesn't work initially also always gets swept under the rug. Anything that doesn't make them money will be forgotten, where they will always prop up their biggest franchises in our face wherever we go in their theme parks or whatever, rather than letting people like Pixar be free to create. I mean, don't get me wrong, they still can and will be able to create these standout films for the studio, but now it's just going to be placed alongside the overworked content schedule of the same familiar stories and sequels or spin-offs, because that's the only thing they can do now within the organization known as Disney. So if they don't realize that their problem relies within themselves and the mitigation of creativity across the board to meet some deadlines for their quarterly earnings, then effectively Disney themselves would have killed Pixar and eventually their own studio for not realizing any of these points at all. But then time can actually prove us otherwise wrong, including myself, and I don't doubt the case that these movies will continue to be successful, especially their sequels, but it is the simple fact that I just wish they have the courage to believe in these films once again like they had for the course of the 2000s to change this landscape and possibility of film. But until that day comes, Disney will always remain to
Alright, next up is me coughing a bunch. God damn, there's so much stuff on here. The best
To be
ripoff of all
frank,
time.
it wasn't until about 3 weeks ago that I started watching this show. I had forgotten about its existence, being too young to understand its complexities during its initial release. Until I walked to class one day, waiting by the door for my teacher to let us in, I looked down to see my friend holding his phone, watching the show. It was blurry as I was standing up and he was crouched over on the floor. And yet, with a single shot and no context to what he was watching, I knew immediately that it was Mr. Robot. Nothing with Rami Malek, no title screen, nothing. It was merely the shot composition that gave it away. And honestly, that's amazing. Mr. Robot is a show from 2015 centered around a hacker with a dream. He works at a cybersecurity company, only being able to push through the day by consuming large amounts of drugs. And yeah, it's not Breaking Bad, I swear to God.
Say my name.
Shadow the Hedgehog's a bitch-ass motherfucker.
And yet, his original purpose still stays, that being to make a change. But obviously, before I can begin shilling the show, I need to talk about the elephant. Fight Club. I had watched Mr. Robot before Fight Club and was dubious about all these claims that it was merely a ripoff of this critically acclaimed movie. And the verdict? Yeah. But it was the best ripoff I've ever seen. I think this quote by the show's creator says it all. I'll say this right now. I rip off of every movie and TV show I've ever seen in my life. I'm a film nerd. Honestly, this is the right attitude for any form of storytelling. Every single concept under the sun has been used, distributed, shown time and time again. Originality is truthfully a thing of the past. So instead of creating a brand new story, which would have been virtually impossible, he leached quite heavily, to be completely frank.
Anyway, I started blasting.
I described the story as if Fight Club was allowed to expand on all the ideas that it wanted to touch on. The fact of the matter is that you can either push all these ideas into a 2.5-hour movie, which is simply not enough time to elaborate on them, or you can give it almost 2 days worth of runtime and flesh things out. Now, this isn't to say Fight Club doesn't work well with what it's been given. Truthfully, this is one of the better movies I've seen. I just think that the longer format of a show could have given it time to blossom, and that's precisely what Mr. Robot did. As Sam Esmail said before, he rips off everything he enjoys, which is what every filmmaker does in some capacity. There's enough to differentiate it from Fight Club and acknowledge it as its own entity. With that said, if you've watched the movie beforehand, you'll be able to point out plot points,
bars, all the way bars,
almost instantaneously, and yet it'll simultaneously surprise you at every turn. Before I continue with the video, if you like anything you see at all, consider hitting the like button, commenting, and subscribing. It would really aid me with the algorithm, and by the end of the video, I will have earned your subscription. Also, I have a Discord server, so if you'd like to join that, that'd be super cool. Let's get into the show.
Let's go!
The show begins with our protagonist, Elliot Alderson, talking directly to us, the viewer, as the opening logos of the show slowly reveal themselves. He states that we're only in his head.
Maybe I should give you a name. Built that to slippery slope. You're only in my head. We have to remember that.
Referring to the possibility of mental illness or paranoia, which is quickly verified by him saying,
"There's a powerful group of people out there that are secretly running the world."
This notion, although completely legitimate in the world of Mr. Robot, is illustrated as the obsessive thoughts of a madman. It cuts to a shot of Elliot being surveilled by men in black, expressing his paranoia and showing to the audience that there might be some plausibility to his conspiracies. One thing I love about this series is its usage of the unreliable narrator.
Where am I? Where's Reznov?
This is a storytelling technique in which the protagonist either has a genuine mental illness and cannot differentiate fact from fiction, or if they're trying to purposefully alter events in an attempt to retain the audience's support. Either way, from this introduction, everything Elliot says from here on out will lack the proper credentials that it needs to form a coherent timeline. Elliot states that he missed out on Angela's, a childhood friend of his, birthday party, instead choosing to pursue a criminal in a cafe. Another thing to notice is the composition of each shot in this scene. The camera never fully fixates on a single character, and when it does, they're off to the side slightly, creating this sense of inadequateness and a belittling lack of power. This little confrontation at the coffee shop acts as our hook to the story, demonstrating how it'll operate moving forward. A hook has to do a couple of things for the viewer, those being introducing the protagonist, introducing the world, setting up a motivation for the protagonist, setting a goal for the show, and, of course, hooking the viewer.
Cheesy.
And Mr. Robot does this masterfully. This scene is a slow build. It begins with Elliot sitting down at a seemingly random man's table, followed by the guy naturally wondering what's happening.
Can I help you with something?
Elliot mentions the gigabit connection that was offered by the shop and says that it scratched the part of his mind that doesn't allow good to exist without condition. This sets up two things. One, that he has an affinity for tech, and two, that his life is bleak, and thus it can be inferred that the rest of the show will follow this pattern, including this very exchange. This is when it is revealed that he is a hacker and Rohit, the man he is pursuing, is a... Ah yes, he must be a Discord mod. And now, under pressure, Rohit attempts to persuade Elliot to not show the evidence to the cops.
I did not hurt anyone. Never did. Personal life.
Elliot mistakenly opens up a little bit, mainly servicing the audience by giving us insight into him.
I understand what it's like to be different. I'm very different, too. I mean, I don't to little kids, but I don't know how to talk to people. My dad was the only one I could talk to, but he died.
How did he pass, may I ask?
Leukemia.
Of course, Rohit takes this opportunity and uses it to exploit him, a last-ditch attempt at trying to save himself. You can actively see his face shift when he has this sudden realization, almost as if a light bulb appeared over his head. They begin talking about how Elliot's dad died of leukemia from radiation. This starts a separate subplot that will be prevalent throughout the entirety of the show. Despite Rohit's manipulation tactics, Elliot seems totally unfazed by everything. When the confrontation reaches its climax, that splendid score by McQuail kicks in, setting up an unnerving techno vibe.
I made sure to include the current time and location on my anonymous tip.
Wait, hold on. I'll give you the money.
Elliot refuses any payment, unveiling that he cares more about justice than his own self-interest. Boom, title card. This hook is spectacular in its delivery. It sets up so much while leaving mysteries here and there to be followed up on eventually. But what really sells it are the shots. This is, as I previously mentioned, what this show is all about. Dynamic, tension-building shots. Everything in this show uses a ton of negative space and characters facing in a direction that is away from our field of view. Since no one ever directly faces the camera, it gives them this feeling that they are weak and small, similar to how Elliot was saying that he was being followed. The shot composition symbolizes powerlessness and how one man can't do anything to change a system that all people rely on. We cut back to the train. A man attempts to talk to Elliot briefly, not taking the hint that he doesn't want to be spoken to. For those that have already watched the series, you'd know this character is very important, but he isn't portrayed that way in these early episodes. He's a figure, a shadow that watches over Elliot. As the episode progresses, we start to see evidence to back up his previous claims, the main one being social anxiety. Sam Esmail, the show's creator, understands the concept of show, don't tell better than most filmmakers. For instance, the black sweatshirt Elliot bears symbolizes the wall he puts up between him and others. It's these little things, the thought patterns, the lack of attachment, that fully realize this character.
Hey.
Hi.
Yo, buddy. Missed you last night. Where were you? Gotta go. Big meeting today.
This is Ollie Parker, wrongfully believing that Elliot's social anxiety is a personal attack against him. He's not wrong to a certain degree, but yeah. He's portrayed as this dim-witted character, almost as if he's the Roy of this world, making Angela Pam. Angela is Elliot's childhood friend, and it's shown later that they both shared a similar experience together. Her mom died from the same radiation that Elliot had, and thus their bond is strong. Strong enough to excuse missing a birthday party, which, to be fair, that's pretty big. It's shown that Elliot has partial feelings for Angela, which are never fully elaborated on because of, plot, but it's in these little interactions that we get to see how they truly feel about each other. There are minor subtleties to their dynamic that reinforce her attachment to him, and although he subconsciously knows that there's no way they could end up together, there's hope in these subtleties. Every single friend, or I suppose acquaintance, that Elliot has made are all hacked by him shortly after they meet. This is due to his unrelenting desire for information and control brought on by childhood trauma, but I'll touch on that a little later. Krista is a victim of this, and despite her purpose being to understand Elliot to the fullest extent, the inverse applies more heavily. Elliot is generally more attentive than her, showing how years of extensive learning don't match actual experience. She's been doing this in a deliberately controlled environment, as opposed to one in which control must be forged. Elliot touches on how the rise of the internet has made us unanimously lose respect for every celebrity or icon or politician there ever was. That's because there's always a shadow behind the highly curated public image that they portray on television, and it's entirely accessible to the public via Google or Internet Explorer if you're a Facebook user. Rest in peace. Perhaps this has to do with Elliot's mistrust for everyone, hence why he needs power in every relationship he's in. Elliot describes how everyone is sedated by wealth and material possessions, but in the end, they're all meaningless.
Fuck society.
What is it about society that disappoints you so much?
Oh, I don't know. Is it that we collectively thought Steve Jobs was a great man, even when we knew he made billions off the backs of children? Or maybe it's that it feels like all our heroes are counterfeit and the world itself's just one big hoax. We do this not because Hunger Games books makes us happy, but because we want to be sedated. Because we're cowards.
When talking to Krista about what happened at Angela's party, he mentions that he got a girl's number. A complete lie simply to make her happy. Through this lie, he's sedating himself into believing that he's happier than he truly is. A form of self-convincing. It doesn't work though. Krista immediately realizing the lie after the Hunger Games is referenced.
I got a girl's number.
You did.
Cute. She likes the Hunger Games.
You're hiding again, Elliot.
Yo, man. Do you wanna do lunch today?
His interaction with Ollie is genuinely painful. You have these two people that don't want to be near each other, but somewhat need to in order to please someone they both care about. Again, Jim, Roy, and Pam, but like cringeworthy and demented. In this scene, we also get a clever insight into Elliot, seeing how he hates being touched. Finally, another introvert such as myself.
Don't you ever touch me.
This is an introduction to the most vital subplot of the show. E-Corp, the biggest company in the world, walks in through the door, a group of men in suits directed to a business room. A man named Tyrell Wellick meets Elliot and introduces himself.
Oh, hi. Tyrell Wellick, Senior Vice President Technology. You know, I started out exactly where you are, and to be honest, my heart is still there, so I see you running GNOME. I know this desktop environment is supposed to be better, but you know what they say, old habits, they die hard.
Immediately, you can tell there's something off about Tyrell. His demeanor, his speech patterns, it's all too charismatic to be as techie as Elliot is. A red flag. Such. I know I'm doing a lot of cuts, but this first episode needs to initiate many character dynamics and subplots, and I kind of need to just bang them out one by one. In the next scene, Elliot is shown crying in a corner, watching as his mom forcefully pushes his younger self on a table. He has no family, no true friends to call on in case of emergency. That's another thing the show does really, really well. Perception. Elliot can call Angela at any moment if he really needed to, but feels that it isn't an option due to his own perception of events. Angela thinks Elliot simply ditched her and didn't want to make an attempt to go to her birthday party at all, but he did, and anxiety got the best of him. Also, in the scene, the character of Shayla is shown, revealing how Elliot is a drug addict and how she's his supplier, somewhat of a symbiotic relationship. They know each other through the drugs, and although he initially wants her out, they end up sleeping together. Afterward, Elliot decides to check on how Krista is doing, noticing that she's currently out to dinner with Michael, her current boyfriend. Through the hack, Elliot finds out that Michael is cheating on his wife with Krista. To hack him, Elliot meets with Michael shortly after his dinner with Krista, requesting to use his phone to call his mom. In reality, Elliot simply called himself, using this as a vessel for finding Michael's phone number. Elliot heads home through the subway, Angela calling him as he comes out, which is when I realized something. Okay, so Krista and Michael are having dinner at night. That's fine, right? But when Angela calls Elliot, he says that it's 3 a.m. What? Do people have dinner this late? Am I mentally deranged? Anyway, there's apparently been a hack at Allsafe, and Lloyd, the current employee working on stopping it, is having difficulty. According to Angela, this was a DDoS attack, meaning that servers from all over the world are working to disrupt this. The attack is strong enough to warrant some questioning, and Elliot comes to the conclusion that there's a rootkit in their servers, which Lloyd then describes as
it's like a crazy serial rapist with a very big dick.
Jesus, Lloyd.
I've made a severe. Gideon is incredibly stressed by everything, which is later brought up on their flight back to New York. Elliot flies over to their servers and performs his techno magic, basically, learning that there's a hidden file in the virus. The virus itself is called fsociety00.dat, hinting at Elliot's declining mental state. Instead of fully deleting the virus, he decides to keep this singular file, making it so that only he can access it. On the flight back, Gideon thanks Elliot for his work. There, he decides to come out as gay, motivated by the thought that this was a hate-based attack, and generally stands as an offering to Elliot.
Did you know that I'm gay?
No.
Consider this me coming out to you then, okay?
Gideon wants to understand him better. Obviously, Elliot is quite reluctant, but Gideon makes his attempt anyway. This continues the trend of Elliot's attachment disorder, a mental condition in where an individual has difficulty either forming relationships or they become excessively clingy. Elliot is the former. This disorder is caused by trauma during the early stages of development, usually when the mind first begins forming, but can occur later in childhood as well. This can easily be linked to his delusions and paranoia, perhaps acting as a hidden catalyst for many events. In the next scene, Elliot is once again on a train, seeing the man he saw earlier sit down in front of him. On this man's shirt, a sign that says Mr. Robot lays embroidered in the fabric, subconsciously increasing Elliot's trust for this man. Now for this, we need to head into spoiler territory. This show has an incredible amount of replay value. There are many little details that won't be caught at first, but when looked back on, really broaden the scale of the bigger picture. This is one of those instances. Normally, Elliot wouldn't have trusted this man at all, but since he not only mentioned the file that he failed to delete,
You should come with me. But only if you didn't delete it.
and wears the symbol of his childhood, Elliot has no choice but to see how far the rabbit hole goes. fsociety00.dat is simply the first example of his childhood coming back to haunt him. This event triggers the part of his brain that makes him question reality from fiction, and he doesn't even know it. Using the knowledge that we learn much later in the series, it can be inferred that this virus that was implanted into the servers was from Elliot himself, or someone that knows him well. Something eerily close planted the clue. He followed the clue. He wanted the clue. His mind, unconsciously, needed him to go on this mission. Tired with his current ordinary life, he strived for an adventure, an experience that wasn't completely lonely. Hence, Mr. Robot. Another thing to notice is the sound design for this scene. When Mr. Robot leaves the train, you hear a voice from the intercom say,
"Stand clear of the closing doors, please."
In both a literal and symbolic sense, his door to happiness, or at least not crippling loneliness, was closing, and thus he shot out of that train. But then Mr. Robot mentions that they're going to Coney Island,
Then what? Then we're going to Brooklyn, out by Coney Island.
which subconsciously unlocks a part of Elliot's brain, a part that's been buried, presumably since childhood. As he asks more questions, Mr. Robot rejects, and
If you want to watch this video, it's by Yisu, Y-I-I-S-U, the best ripoff of all time. I will link it when I can in the description. Thank you all for watching our part 2. We will be back bright and early tomorrow between 4 and 6 a.m. My name is Jamie and I can't play guitar. We'll see you next time.